The non-belief is incoherent omnibus. Number 7. The argument from undemonstrated possibility. Premise 1. We cannot consider something as possible without some precedent, parallel, or verified phenomenon indicating the existence of such possibility. It is fallacious to argue that anything is possible, as such an argument does not exclude violations of known philosophical principles, such as the principle of non-contradiction, which necessarily entails certain preclusions. This argument, that anything is possible, is essentially an argument from ignorance or an argument from incredulity, both of which are logical fallacies. Premise 2. There is no precedent, parallel, or verified phenomenon indicating a genuine state of finding neither of a pair of binary propositions to be any more likely than the alternative by any degree whatsoever. As beliefs are private mental events, they are not subject to direct empirical observation, testing, and verification. Instead, all we have are fallible self-reports of individuals' subjective experience, which are prone to error due to faulty reasoning such as biases and presumed objectivity and rationality. Further, a suspension of judgment does not equate to a suspension of belief. Secondly, a suspension of judgment as an admission that one does not know the truth value of P substantiates only agnosticism, an epistemological position. It does not address belief, a doxastic position at all, much less substantiate an absence of belief. Thirdly, whereas the suspension of judgment is an act of will, the suspension of belief presumes that one can choose what one does and does not believe, which is an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. Conclusion. It cannot be considered possible to believe neither of a pair of binary propositions. The presumed absence of belief precludes the possibility of the presence of a subconsciously held belief that needn't be logical due to having been involuntarily formed by a wide variety of factors beyond evidence and reason that includes, but is not limited to, beliefs, biases, other cognitive functions, cultural influences, emotions, personal experiences, pre-existing beliefs, and social pressures, and this preclusion is unjustified.
The argument under consideration fails to be persuasive. Rather than relying on sound premises, the argument disguises its flaws with ambiguity and verbosity. The reader's ability to understand the argument is hampered needlessly. The argument hangs itself on a self-defeating epistemic principle, an assumption that all binary propositions must have a comparative likelihood, and a conflation of different categories between premises. Our aim is to present both premises as untenable, and as a result that the conclusion cannot follow. Let's look at the first premise: we cannot consider something as possible without some precedent, parallel, or verified phenomenon indicating the existence of such a possibility. The most evident problem of this premise is the ambiguity. The premise does not specify what kind of possibility it refers to. It could mean a logical possibility where a statement is considered possible if it doesn't contain a contradiction. It could mean a sort of restricted possibility such as epistemic or physical possibility. For example, if I say that it is impossible for heat to travel through a vacuum, I am appealing to a physical possibility. Restricted possibilities assume a set of background conditions which logical possibilities don't. There is nothing logically impossible about heat traveling through a vacuum, there is no contradiction. However, with the consideration of the laws of nature, or the laws of physics, it becomes physically impossible. Likewise, something in this context is also ambiguous. The possibility of which something is in question. It would be a mistake to apply physical possibilities onto abstract objects. The premise doesn't specify if the something under consideration is a physical occurrence, an abstract object, or a theoretical concept. Considering the language of the premise, it could be interpreted as epistemic or physical in nature because of the phrase, verified phenomenon. Such language is used within logical positivism and the verification principle. The insistence on a restrictive verification standard exposes a weakness in the argument. Premise 1 is an extremely strong claim that lacks justification. Why should we require precedent, parallel, or verification to even consider something as possible? There are several counterexamples to undermine this premise. The discovery of new physical phenomena, such as black holes, often occurred before there was any direct precedent. Even theoretical mathematics postulates possibilities that lack empirical precedent. If precedent is required for possibility, then the first occurrence of anything, including life arising in the universe, would become impossible, an obviously absurd conclusion. To put this argument to bed, consider its self-defeating nature. The premise demands precedent or verification to consider something possible. But if this principle is true, then it must apply to itself. Since it lacks precedent or verification, it becomes self-refuting. Much like the verification principle, the argument demands criteria that it cannot meet itself. If we were to rescue the argument, we might replace the word possibility with probability. Possibility means that something can happen, it is not logically or physically impossible. Probability measures how likely something is to happen. Something can be possible but highly improbable, such as winning the lottery. Just because something lacks precedent does not mean it is impossible, but it could mean that it is improbable. If the author meant to speak about probability, which is what the second premise is more concerned about, then the premise should be rewritten accordingly. But the premise as presented overstates its claim, and is demonstrably false. Moving on to premise 2, there is no precedent, parallel, or verified phenomenon indicating a genuine state of finding neither of a pair of binary propositions to be any more likely than the alternative by any degree whatsoever. This premise is a claim about epistemic probabilities and justification. Finding in this sense is not equivalent to believing. One could find that two propositions are equally probable without forming a belief about either. Belief requires more than finding one proposition more likely than another. Belief requires conviction and psychological commitment. Because the argument fails to bridge the gap between probability and belief, premise 2 cannot be used to support the conclusion. However, as practice, let us directly challenge the premise on its own merits, sans any argument. The language of the premise does not adequately qualify what it means by a pair of binary propositions. The interpretation I'm led to assume is, two mutually exclusive statements where one must be true and the other false. For example, a number is even versus a number is not even. For now, consider these two mutually exclusive statements. F1, the present King of France is bald, and F2, the present King of France is not bald. At first glance, this seems to fit the definition of a pair of binary propositions. One of these statements must be true, and the other must be false. However, since there is no present King of France, assigning a truth value to either statement is problematic. It would be weird to consider F1 as true. This weirdness might lead us to consider F1 as false and F2 as true, which is also just as weird. The non-existence of the subject makes either assignment problematic. This demonstrates a truth value gap, a case where neither statement is strictly true or false due to presupposition failure. If neither statement can be determined as true, then neither can be said to be found more likely than the other, directly refuting premise 2. Now consider real cases where neither of a pair of binary propositions is more likely than the other. This happens in situations of epistemic underdetermination, where available evidence does not favor one proposition over its negation. The fate of the lost Roanoke colonists remains underdetermined to this day, due to insufficient evidence. The Roanoke colony was an English settlement established on Roanoke Island in 1587. When a supply ship returned in 1590, the colony had mysteriously disappeared. The only clue left behind was the word Croton carved into a tree. There are a number of competing hypotheses: assimilation into indigenous tribes, violent conflict, or an attempt to return to England. Each has some supporting evidence, but no clear justification for assigning a greater probability to one over the others. In this case, epistemic responsibility would lead us to suspend judgment, meaning we do not consider either propositions, the colonists assimilated versus the colonists did not assimilate, as more likely than the other. Since cases like Roanoke show that sometimes the available evidence does not favor one side by any degree, then a genuine suspension of judgment is possible. Again, directly refuting premise 2. The final conclusion states, it cannot be considered possible to believe neither of a pair of binary propositions. This does not follow from the premises, and is demonstrably false. The argument fails to bridge the logical gaps between premises because the argument simply jumps between three different categories, from possibility to probability, and probability to belief. Premise 1 restricts what we can consider possible based on precedent. Premise 2 makes a claim about epistemic probabilities, and the conclusion falsely asserts something about belief. As previously mentioned, premise 2 cannot be used to support the conclusion. And if premise 1 were taken as true, the argument would need a precedent or verification that suspending belief is impossible, but no such precedent exists. The argument is flawed and can be dismissed. The argument relies on a chain of dubious conflations between different categories. The verbose and ambiguous language only inhibits the reader's ability to understand the premises, hiding these leaps of logic. Taking premise 1 as true only hangs the argument as self-defeating. And premise 2 not only doesn't support the conclusion, but is empirically and logically false.